The predator's claws clicked against polished stone as they walked into the chamber of 47 species. The vet's hand rested on the creature's head. Not a scanner, not a weapon, just a palm flat against matted fur, fingers buried to the second knuckle. The human had no sedation, no protocol, no backup. 3 minutes ago, security had tried to stop them. The creature they had ordered destroyed now walked at his side. Duke's 6 legs moved in a rolling gait, dagger teeth hidden behind closed jaws. His left side still favored the ribs that had been broken. A thin scar ran the length of his foreleg where gel had sealed bone. He wore no leash. He wore no containment field. He simply walked because the hand on his head asked him to. 47 species watched from tiered seats. Compound eyes and optical enhancers and simple retinas. Mandibles clicked in geometric patterns. A low murmur spread through the assembly, the sound of 200 translators working overtime. Ben Foster felt the sweat on his lower back. Montana mountain clinics didn't prepare you for galactic politics. He kept his pace even. His thumb traced the line of scar tissue behind Duke's ear, the spot where the Dravok liked to be scratched. Security hands hovered near weapons. The council chair, a Crovan with a crystalline body that fractured light into rainbows, raised one limb. The gesture meant stand down. The gesture also meant this had never happened before. Ben reached the center of the aisle. He stopped. Duke stopped beside him, flank pressed to Ben's thigh, weight warm and solid and alive. "You're all scared," Ben said, his voice carried in the silence. "That's good. Healthy fear keeps you safe, but fear without understanding is just prejudice wearing logic's uniform." He looked down at Duke. The Dravok looked back, pupils wide and calm. Ben's fingers found the scar again. "Easy, buddy," he whispered. "I've got you." Duke's tail thumped once against the stone. 3 days earlier, Ben stepped off the transport into Station Harmony and immediately smelled recycled coolant. The corridors were cold metal. Gray walls, gray floors, gray ceiling panels that hummed with ventilation. Everything designed to be cleaned easily. Nothing designed to be lived in. He shifted his duffel bag to his other shoulder and felt the worn leather leash inside bump against his hip. No medical instruments. No scanner. Just the leash he'd used for 12 years in Montana, the one his first rescue dog had chewed half through. A Quellan assistant met him at the docking junction. Small, gray-skinned eyes that darted to every corner of the corridor before settling on Ben's face. "Dr. Foster, the transfer from Earth." "That's the one." Ben adjusted his collar. The station temperature was set for author and comfort, which meant his lungs worked harder than they needed to. "You the welcome committee." The medical bay. Dr. Nara requested immediate orientation. The Quellan's fingers twisted together. "There's a situation." Ben followed. The corridors blurred past, identical junctions, identical warning monitors. He counted the containment fields they passed. 3, 7, 12, each one a glass wall and a red light, and something moving behind it that he couldn't see clearly. They stopped at Bay 7. The Quellan didn't step closer. Neither did the 2 staff members already present, both maintaining a precise 3-meter distance from the glass. Through the transparency, Ben saw blood. It splattered the floor in arcs dark against the gray metal. A creature thrashed against restraints that sparked with each impact. 6 legs, each thicker than Ben's thigh. Fur matted with fluid. Dagger teeth bared in a rictus that could have been rage or could have been something else. Dr. Nara stood at the monitoring station, her insectoid frame rigid in a pristine medical uniform. Compound eyes refracted the bay lights into geometric shards. Her mandibles clicked twice, then stopped. "The Dravok is dying," she said, "and there is nothing I can do about it." Ben stepped closer to the glass. The creature's eyes were wide, pupils dilated to black pools. It guarded its left side, favoring the foreleg. Each thrash ended with a protective curl toward that flank. Not random, patterned. Ben had seen it before in 1,000 barns and back pastures. "Heart rate increasing," Nara continued. "Internal bleeding worsening, sedation ineffective at standard dosage. Second dose would kill it before it calmed." "What's the protocol?" Ben asked. Nara's head turned. Her eyes caught the light and scattered it. "Humane termination. Dangerous animals in critical pain cannot be approached. The regulations are explicit." From the doorway, a figure shifted. Captain Roth, his rocky Grenic features catching the corridor light, his stoic expression doing a poor job of hiding concern. "I've transported animals for 20 years. This one was stable when we loaded it. Something happened in transit." "Something is irrelevant," Nara said. "The outcome is terminal. I have memorized every medical text, every procedure, every protocol for 30 years. There is no treatment path." Ben pressed his palm to the glass. Cold, The Dravok's thrashing vibrated through it, a low frequency that traveled up his arm and into his chest. The creature's nose was dry, cracked. The panting was rapid, shallow, the kind that came from panic more than exertion. "Has anyone spoken to it?" Ben asked. Nara's mandibles clicked. Once, twice. A pattern Ben would learn meant she was processing data that didn't fit her models. Spoken to it. Not about it, to it. The Dravok does not possess language comprehension in the clinical sense. It is a Deathworld apex predator. Its behavioral programming contains no trust protocols. Any approach without sedation would result in immediate termination of the approaching individual. Ben watched the eyes, wide, dilated, guarding the left side. "Look at his eyes," Ben said. "Really look at them." "I have looked, I have recorded, I have analyzed." "You're seeing aggression, I'm seeing fear." Nara's posture didn't change. Her uniform stayed pristine, but her mandibles clicked again, and this time they didn't stop. Ben entered the containment field 17 minutes later. The staff had argued. Nara had cited statistics, her neural processing faster than most species, her logic unassailable. Captain Roth had objected once, then fallen silent when the protocol citations began. The Quellan assistant monitored vitals from the farthest corner, fingers white where they gripped the console. Ben wore no protective gear. He carried no sedation. His duffel bag sat outside the field, the worn leather leash visible where the flap had fallen open. He stepped through the shimmer of the containment boundary. The Dravok stopped thrashing. For 3 seconds nothing moved. The creature's chest heaved. Its eyes found Ben, tracked him, held him. Ben didn't look away, but he didn't stare directly either. He turned his body at an angle, presenting his shoulder rather than his front. He lowered his height, crouching until his knees touched the cold metal floor. "Easy, buddy," he whispered. "Easy now." The Dravok's ears twitched, forward, then back. A signal Ben had seen in frightened dogs, in cornered cats, in horses that had been mishandled until they learned to bite first. Ben kept his voice low, the register he used for animals in shock. Not the high, bright tone of excitement, not the sharp commands of training. The soft, steady murmur of someone who wasn't going anywhere. "I'm not going to hurt you. I know you're hurting. I know you don't know if I'm safe. That's okay. You don't have to know yet." He moved his hand, slow as sap in winter, and placed it on the floor between them. Palm up, empty. The Dravok's nose twitched. It leaned forward, nostrils flaring, and sniffed the air above Ben's fingers. Nara's voice came through the calm, flat and fast. Heart rate still elevated. Muscle tension unchanged. Statistical models predict attack within 90 seconds. Ben didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the Dravok's chest, watching the rhythm of breath. In, out, in. The creature's left foreleg trembled when it shifted weight, protective, guarded. 3 broken ribs, Ben said, not to Nara, to the air, to the creature. Puncture somewhere deep. You're holding that leg because it hurts to put weight on it. You're panting because you're scared, not because you're tired. He shifted his weight, a microscopic movement, and the Dravok's head followed. Not aggressive. Curious, terrified curiosity, the kind that came before a decision. Ben reached up, slow, slower than he'd ever moved in Montana, where a frightened stallion had once broken his ribs and he'd still gone back the next day with the same soft voice. His fingers found the matted fur behind the Dravok's ear, the scar tissue, the spot where something had healed wrong. The Dravok leaned into the touch. Nara's mandibles went silent. Scanners don't build trust. Ben said it 2 hours later, his hand still on the Dravok's head, his other arm wrapped around the creature's neck while he palpated the ribcage by feel. The Dravok, he was calling him Duke now, the name emerging unplanned, the kind of name you gave a dog that followed you home, had allowed full examination, had allowed a drainage tube, had allowed gel application to the fractured leg. Nara stood at the field boundary, her pristine uniform somehow still pristine, her compound eyes fixed on the readouts that didn't match her models. Scanner verification would confirm your diagnostic hypotheses. Without confirmation, treatment is empirically unsupported. Then watch. Ben pressed his palm flat against Duke's chest, feeling the heartbeat, the flutter of lungs working around the puncture. Feel this, the rhythm steadier than when I came in. His nose is wet now, see. He held up his hand, glistening where Duke had licked it. Nara didn't move closer. Her optical enhancers zoomed, adjusted, recorded. The blanket, Ben said, for shock, and the temperature in here needs to come up 5 degrees. He's cold. For what purpose would a blanket serve? The Dravok's fur provides adequate thermal insulation per species data. His fur is matted with blood and fierce sweat. He's shivering, not because he's weak, because he's been fighting for 6 hours and he's exhausted. Ben tucked the thermal blanket around Duke's flank, tucking it under the 6 legs with the same motion he used for foals in spring blizzards. Clean and sterile aren't the same thing, Doctor. This bay is clean. It's not safe. Nara's mandibles clicked. Once, the pattern Ben was learning meant she had no response in her database. Duke whined, a low sound almost subsonic that vibrated through Ben's chest where their bodies touched. The Dravok pressed his head harder against Ben's shoulder, the dagger teeth inches from Ben's throat, and closed his eyes. Ben scratched behind the ear, the scarred one. Duke's tail thumped once against the metal floor. That should not have worked, Nara said. It did, Ben said. He was sitting on the floor now, legs numb from the cold, Duke's weight heavy and warm against his side. He hadn't slept in 30 hours, hadn't eaten since the transport, and his hands smelled like predator fur and medical gel. It did because he needed someone to stop being scared of him long enough to see what he actually needed. Nara watched them. Her models were silent. Her mandibles were silent. For 30 years, she had processed medical data faster than most species. And for the first time, she was holding information that wouldn't sort. Ben slept on the medical bay floor that night. He woke to Nara's voice, flat and urgent, coming through the comm before his eyes fully opened. Dr. Foster, Bay 12. Immediate. Duke was stable, breathing even, the blanket still tucked around his 6 legs. Ben checked the vitals on his way out, a glance, a hand on the warm fur, a whispered, "Stay, buddy, I'll be back." The Dravok didn't open his eyes. His tail thumped once. Bay 12 was colder. Ben felt it in his lungs before he reached the glass. Inside, a creature coiled against the far wall, scales the color of old ash. Crocodile-dragon hybrid, Ben's memory supplied from the briefing files he'd skimmed on transport. Talvex, high-gravity native. 3 facilities had refused treatment. Incompatible biology. Stryker, a voice said, a keeper, humanoid, hands pressed to the glass. His name is Stryker. I've had him 4 cycles. They said he was aggressive. They said he couldn't be handled. Ben looked at the temperature readout. 2 degrees. Standard station setting for Altharan comfort. The Talvex's scales were cracked, dull, the kind of deterioration Ben had seen in reptiles kept too cold for too long. How long has he been at this temperature? Ben asked. 6 cycles, the keeper said. Voss, the name tag read. Since he arrived, they said his biology required it. They said wrong. Ben stepped to the containment boundary. Stryker's head rose, jaws opening, a hiss that filled the bay with sulfur tang. Ben didn't enter. Not yet. He placed his palm flat on the floor inside the field, pressing it to the metal that had been holding 2 degrees for 6 cycles. Cold, bone cold. He kept it there. His hand ached. The numbness spread to his wrist. Stryker watched. The hiss stopped. The creature leaned forward, nostrils flaring, and crept toward the warmth. "You're not dying from injury," Ben said soft, the same register he'd used with Duke. "You're dying from cold, from loneliness, from being kept at a temperature that suits everyone except you." He didn't move. He let Stryker come. The Talvex's scales brushed his palm, rough and dry and desperate for heat. Ben shifted, slow, and sat cross-legged on the freezing metal. He opened his arms, a posture he'd used for iguanas, for tortoises, for any cold-blooded thing that needed a warm place to rest. Stryker laid his head in Ben's lap. Voss made a sound behind the glass, something broken and relieved. Nara, who had followed Ben to Bay 12 and stood now at the monitoring station, said nothing at all. Her mandibles were silent. Her compound eyes reflected the scene in geometric shards that didn't compute. Ben stroked the scales. They were warming, color returning at the edges, a deep amber emerging from the ash. 35 to 40 degrees, he said. That's what he needs, not medicine, not surgery, warmth, and someone who doesn't flinch. He looked up at Nara. She was watching Stryker's vitals scroll across her screen, watching numbers change that shouldn't change, watching a creature that had been dying warm itself against a human chest and choose to live. That should not have worked, Nara said. It was becoming a refrain. Ben rested his chin on Stryker's head. The scales were rough against his jaw. "I'm not treating symptoms," he said. "I'm treating causes. Most vets see a sick animal and ask, what's wrong with it? I ask, what does it need?" Nara's optical enhancers zoomed, recorded, stored data that would not fit her 30 years of models. The emergency klaxon cut through station harmony 18 hours later. Ben was on the medical bay floor again, Duke's head in his lap, Stryker's warming scales still fresh in his memory. The sound drove him to his feet, heart hammering, the Montana instinct for disaster rising in his throat. Nara's voice came through every comm in the station, flat and fast and somehow different. "All personnel, Docking Bay Alpha, colony transport emergency, multiple species, multiple casualties." Ben ran. The corridors blurred, gray on gray, and he thought of barn fires, of flood evacuations, of the time a mudslide had buried half a herd and he'd worked until his hands wouldn't close around a syringe. Duke followed, 6 legs eating the distance, no leash, no command, just the bond that had formed in blood and whispered reassurance. The docking bay was chaos. A transport vessel had come in hard, hull breached, atmosphere leaking. Creatures spilled from the cargo doors, some walking, some carried, some dragged by keepers whose faces held the blank shock of too many hours without answers. Ben counted without meaning to. 53. 53 creatures of 20 different species, some he'd never seen, some he recognized from briefing files. A falcon with feathers matted in zero-G condensation. A quadruped with legs bent at wrong angles. Something that looked like a cross between a badger and a lobster clicking pincers into stress patterns. 27 keepers, most untrained, assigned to this transport because they were available, not because they knew the animals. They held leads and cages and blankets that weren't enough, and they looked at Ben with the same expression Voss had worn. The same expression Ben felt on his own face in mirrors after hard nights. Nara stood at the triage station, her uniform still pristine, her voice carrying over the din. Standard protocol is triage, save who we can. Priority to species with highest survival probability. The rest what? Ben's voice cut through. He was breathing hard, stained from the floor, his hands still smelling of Dravok fur and Talvek scales. The rest you write off. Then we make time, Ben said. He turned to the keepers, to the frightened faces, to the creatures that were dying not from injury, but from the terror of 6 hours in zero-G and cold metal, and no one they knew. You, what's your name? A small figure stepped forward. Humanoid, young, maybe 8 cycles old by standard measure. She held a cage with a falcon inside, the bird's eyes wild, its wings pressed against the bars. Myra, she said. The falcon's name is Sky. I've had him 2 days. He won't stop screaming. Ben knelt to her level. His knees cracked. He ignored it. Sky's not screaming because he's hurt. He's screaming because he's scared and he doesn't know if you're coming back. You need to tell him you are. I don't know how. Yes, you do. Ben took her hand, placed it on the cage bars where Sky could see it. Talk to him, not about him, to him, soft, like you're sorry he's scared and you're not leaving. Myra's voice trembled. Easy, Sky, easy now, I've got you. The falcon's scream stopped. Its head turned. One eye bright and black fixed on her hand. Ben moved through the crowd. 10 minutes. He had 10 minutes to teach 27 keepers what had taken him 20 years to learn. He showed the Grenic transport worker how to press his rocky palm flat against a trembling flank. He taught the Quellan assistant to whisper instead of monitor. He stood beside a lion official with blue skin and conservation credentials, and showed her that the endangered specimen in her arms wasn't data, was someone who needed to hear a voice before it could believe it was safe. The keepers learned, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Myra opened Sky's cage. The falcon stepped onto her wrist, feathers settling, and pressed his head against her thumb. The field that had been suppressing his vital signs dropped. His heartbeat stabilized in her arms, fast and frightened and alive. All 53. Ben collapsed onto a cargo crate, his hands shaking so badly he had to grip his knees to stop them. He hadn't eaten in 16 hours. Hadn't slept in 40. His shirt was torn where Duke had leaned against him, where Stryker's scales had caught the fabric, where a frightened quadruped had clawed in panic before learning to trust. Nara stood at the edge of the crate, her compound eyes catching the bay lights. She didn't speak. Her mandibles clicked once, a single sound that held no pattern Ben recognized. That should not have worked, she said, but her voice was different now. Not flat, not fast, something underneath that Ben couldn't name because Nara's species didn't have words for the things she was feeling. It did, Ben said. He was too tired to stand, too tired to explain, too tired to do anything but sit on cold metal and feel the weight of 53 lives that had chosen to stay. It did because someone asked what they needed instead of what was wrong with them. Nara watched him. Her models were silent. Her 30 years of protocol sat in her memory banks, sorted and cross-referenced and suddenly insufficient. Behind her, a young Altheran named Tick stood in the corridor shadows. He had watched the triage without authorization, without assignment, drawn by sounds he didn't understand. His mandibles clicked in a rhythm no adult would use, a child's pattern of curiosity and confusion. He looked at Ben. He looked at Duke, who had waited at the bay entrance, 6 legs planted, watching his human with the calm patience of a creature who had learned that some hands stayed. Tick didn't speak. He filed the image away in a memory that would not sort properly either. The comm chimed. Nara's head turned, her optical enhancers reading the message before Ben could ask. "The Galactic Veterinary Council," she said. "They've requested your presence. Anomalous methodology presentation, neutral territory, 47 species represented." Ben laughed. It came out broken, exhausted, the kind of laugh that wasn't funny. "They want me to explain why being kind works. They want you to explain why their models don't." Nara paused, her mandibles clicked, once, twice. The pattern was changing, Ben realized, had been changing since Base 7. "I have compiled data, species-specific comfort needs, temperature variations, behavioral markers they do not record if you require assistance." Ben looked at her. The pristine uniform, the compound eyes that refracted light into shards, the mandibles that had clicked in patterns of dismissal and now clicked in patterns that might eventually become something else. "I require the leash," Ben said. "The worn one from my bag." Nara didn't ask why. She retrieved it, the leather soft from years of use, the chew marks from a dog long dead. She held it out with the same precision she used for surgical instruments. Ben took it. He ran his thumb over the scarred leather, feeling the history in the grain. 47 species, he said, and one Dravok who shouldn't be alive. He stood, his legs held. Duke rose with him, 6 legs finding balance, scarred forelegs steady. The Dravok's tail thumped once against the docking bay floor, a sound that echoed in the metal corridors of Station Harmony. Ben looked at Nara. He looked at the 53 creatures settling into warming bays, into familiar voices, into the strange new understanding that someone had finally asked what they needed. "Easy, buddy," he whispered to Duke. But he was looking at all of them. "I've got you." The corridor stretched ahead, cold and gray, and leading toward something that would either change everything or end in the same termination protocols that had almost claimed Duke 3 days before. Ben walked toward it. Duke walked beside him. The leash hung loose in Ben's hand, unnecessary, essential, a promise made of worn leather and 12 years of Montana mornings. Behind them, Tick watched from the shadows. His mandibles clicked once, a single sound in the silence. The transport to the Galactic Veterinary Council took 14 hours. Ben spent 11 of them practicing his speech in the mirror of his cramped cabin, watching his mouth form words that sounded hollow even to him. He straightened his shirt 3 times. He ran his thumb over the worn leather leash until the grain was as familiar as his own heartbeat. Then he set it down and stared at the wall, thinking of Montana winters and the way a frightened horse would eventually lower its head if you simply stayed long enough. Duke slept on the floor beside him, 6 legs tucked beneath his body, scarred foreleg twitching in dreams. The Dravok's breathing was steady now, a rhythm Ben had learned to read like music. In, out, the slight catch where the punctured lung had healed, the deeper note where ribs had knitted wrong but strong. Nara had sent data, species-specific comfort parameters, temperature gradients, behavioral markers that her models had never weighted properly. Ben scrolled through it on his tablet, the Altheran notation crisp and precise, every entry cross-referenced and verified. It was the most thorough research he'd ever seen, and it was all about what her species had been missing. He fell asleep with the tablet on his chest and the leash in his hand. The council chamber sat on a neutral moon, built from white stone that absorbed starlight and released it in soft luminescence. The corridors were wide enough for species of any size, the air filtered for oxygen breathers and methane processors alike. Ben walked them with Duke at his side, the Dravok's claws clicking against stone that had never known predator tread. 47 species. He saw them in the antechamber, in the tiered seats, in the security stations where hands and claws and tentacles hovered near weapons that had never been designed for a situation like this. A Krovan with crystalline limbs that fractured light into rainbows. A lion with blue skin and conservation credentials that suddenly seemed insufficient. Altherans with compound eyes that refracted the chamber lights into geometric shards. Dozens of them. The senior medical staff of a dozen stations. A security officer, species Ben didn't recognize, stepped into his path. "The Dravok cannot enter the assembly. Protocol for dangerous specimens." Ben stopped. Duke stopped beside him, flank pressed to Ben's thigh, calm as morning. "He's not a specimen, he's my patient. And I'm not presenting without him. The council can tell me themselves." Ben's voice stayed soft, the register he used for frightened animals, but there was steel underneath it now. 3 days of proving what he knew of sleeping on floors and teaching in 10-minute bursts and watching scales regain color. He wasn't leaving Duke in a holding cell. "They want to understand why their models don't work. He is the reason, not the data, him." The officer's appendages shifted. Weapons remained holstered. A message passed through channels Ben couldn't see, and then the officer stepped aside. "Follow the center aisle," he said. "Do not deviate." Ben walked, Duke walked. The leash hung loose in Ben's hand, unnecessary, essential, the worn leather warm from his grip. The center aisle stretched before them, longer than it had looked from the entrance. Ben felt every eye, every compound lens, every optical enhancer. He felt the weight of 47 species watching a human walk a deathworld predator into their chamber of laws. He reached the podium. He stopped. Duke stopped beside him, 6 legs planted, scarred forelegs steady. The Dravok's tail thumped once against the white stone. Ben looked up at the tiered seats, at the Krovan council chair with light fracturing through crystalline limbs, at the Altheran delegation, Nara among them, her pristine uniform somehow less pristine than Ben remembered, a smudge of medical gel on the sleeve where she had assisted with Stryker's warming. "You're all scared," Ben said, his voice carried in the silence. "That's good. Healthy fear keeps you safe. But fear without understanding is just prejudice wearing logic's uniform." He placed his hand on Duke's massive head. The Dravok leaned into the touch, eyes half closed, the same posture he had taken in the blood-splattered containment field 3 days before. "You've built systems to manage dangerous animals," Ben continued. "Sedation protocols, termination orders, containment fields that keep your distance comfortable, but you've never asked why they're dangerous." His fingers found the scar behind Duke's ear, the spot where trust had formed in defiance of every model. "Duke was dying when I met him. Internal bleeding. Broken ribs, punctured lung, your protocol said terminate. Humane, you called it. Compassionate, you called it. But Duke wasn't dangerous because he was violent. He was dangerous because he was terrified and in pain, and no one had ever taught him that hands could be gentle." Ben knelt. The stone was cold against his knees. He kept his hand on Duke's head, the other flat against the Dravok's chest, feeling the heartbeat that should have stopped 3 days ago. "Your risk assessments measure teeth and claws and muscle density. They don't measure fear. They don't measure the temperature where a cold-blooded creature can actually metabolize. They don't measure the sound of a keeper's voice when she's finally close enough to be heard." Duke shifted. The movement was small, a weight adjustment, but in the silence of 47 species it sounded like thunder. "Every animal I've treated on Station Harmony was misdiagnosed. Not because your medicine is wrong, because your observation is incomplete. You see a predator and you see a weapon. I see a predator, and I see someone who needs to know they're safe before they can show you who they are." Ben's thumb traced the scar. Duke's eyes opened, calm and wide and present. "Give them a reason not to kill," Ben said. "Not through force, through trust, through the radical, inefficient, completely unscalable act of being present until they believe you." Duke moved. From the front row, a young Altheran named Tick jumped back, mandibles clicking in the startled pattern of a child who had seen too much termination in his short life. Security hands found weapons. The Krovan council chair raised a crystalline limb, the gesture that meant stand down, the gesture that meant this had never happened before. Duke simply lay down, 6 legs folded beneath him. His massive body settled against the white stone. And then, in the center of the Galactic Veterinary Council, in front of 47 species who had written his kind into termination protocols, Duke rolled onto his back. His belly, pale and vulnerable and completely unprotected, faced the ceiling. His dagger teeth pointed upward, harmless as a smile. His tail thumped against the stone, a steady rhythm that filled the silence. 47 species gasped simultaneously. The sound was not uniform, not organized, not anything that could be modeled. It was the sound of every assumption breaking at once. A xenobiologist in the 3rd tier, species Ben didn't know, whispered into a translator that broadcast to every ear in the chamber. "Dravok never shows submission. There is no behavioral programming for trust. There is no record in any database of this posture from this species." Ben knelt beside the exposed belly. He placed his palm flat against the fur, feeling the warmth, the heartbeat, the complete surrender of a creature that had been built by evolution to trust no one. "Easy, buddy," he whispered. "I've got you." Duke's tail thumped harder. A sound emerged from his throat, low and rumbling, the same subsonic whine he had made in the medical bay when he first pressed his head to Ben's chest. Happy sounds. Contentment sounds. Sounds that had no place in any database, in any protocol, in any model that had ever governed galactic veterinary medicine. The Krovan council chair lowered her crystalline limb. Light fractured through her body in patterns that might have been emotion, might have been calculation, might have been something no human had words for. "Motion called," she said. Her voice carried the weight of neutral territory, of laws that governed 200 species. "Foster protocol, mandatory emotional connection assessment prior to any termination order. Temperature and environmental matching as standard of care. Species-specific behavioral observation weighted equally with clinical data. The vote tally blinked across every screen in the chamber. Green, green, green. Nera's mandibles stopped clicking. The council chamber emptied slowly. Representatives approached in ones and twos, questions spilling from translators in half a dozen languages. Ben answered until his voice went rough, until Duke rose from his back and pressed against his thigh, the signal that the Dravok was ready to leave. Tick stood at the edge of the aisle, small and gray and uncertain. His mandibles clicked in the child's pattern of curiosity, the same pattern Ben had heard in the station harmony corridor after the mass triage. "He's soft," Tick said, not a question, an observation that didn't fit his models. Ben nodded. "You can touch him if you want." Tick's hand extended, small and precise, the fingers of a species built for surgical dexterity. He touched Duke's fur, the matted patch where blood had dried and been washed away, the scarred ear, the spot behind it where Ben always scratched. Duke leaned into the touch, his tail thumped. Tick's compound eyes reflected the scene in geometric shards that finally, for the first time, held something other than confusion. "I want to learn," he said. "What you did, how you knew." Ben looked at the young Althuran, at the mandibles that had clicked in dismissal and now clicked in something that might, eventually, become hope. "You start by not being scared of them," Ben said. "The rest they teach you." 1 year later, Station Harmony had gardens. Nera had redesigned the medical bays herself. Temperature rooms for cold-blooded species, warm stones where Talvex could rest, dirt beds where burrowing creatures could dig, water features where aquatic patients could heal in familiar gravity. The corridors still hummed with ventilation, but now they smelled of soil and growing things instead of recycled coolant. "Clean and sterile aren't the same thing," Nera said when Ben asked about the changes. Her uniform was still pristine, but her compound eyes reflected the garden lights in patterns that no longer confused her. She had learned to weight emotional data. She was still learning. The process would take years. 10 pilot stations had adopted Foster Protocol. The reports came in monthly. 85% success rates where 60 had been acceptable. Staff injury reduced by more than half. Recovery times faster. Medication costs halved not because medicine was withheld, but because trust did the work that drugs had been failing to do. 300 applicants from 40 species waited for training slots at the Galactic Center for Veterinary Excellence. The name had changed from Station Harmony 6 months after the council vote. 50 human vets recruited from Earth, from Montana mountain clinics and urban shelters and backyard practices, where they had learned the same lessons Ben had learned in blood and whispered reassurance. The Endangered Species Breeding Program occupied the top deck, a habitat of controlled environments and patient keepers. 14 of 17 species had made it in the first 6 weeks. The lion officials, blue-skinned and conservation-focused, had stopped treating their specimens as data points. They had started asking what they needed. Ben walked the garden paths in the evenings, Duke at his side, the worn leather leash still hanging loose in his hand. The Dravok's scarred foreleg had healed strong enough to run, and run he did, 6 legs eating the distance of the habitat track, tail high, the predator that had been ordered terminated now chasing butterflies through alien flowers. The memorial stone stood in the garden center. White stone like the council chamber, but warmer, lit from within by the same luminescence that had guided Ben down the center aisle. The inscription read, "Every creature, no matter how small or strange or dangerous, deserves someone who will look at them and say, 'Easy, buddy, I've got you.'" Below it, thousands of names, keepers who had learned, patients who had survived. The list grew daily, added by hands and claws and tentacles that had finally learned to write in the language of presence. Tick had added his name in Althuran's script, precise and small, the first of his species to complete the training. He worked in Bay 12 now, the warming bay, where Stryker's successors rested against heated stone and learned that hands could be warm. Ben stopped at the stone. He ran his thumb over the inscription, feeling the grooves, the permanence of words that had started as a whisper in a containment field. Duke pressed against his thigh, a signal, a presence, a trust that had outlived every protocol designed to end it. From the breeding habitat, a sound emerged, high, fragile. The first chirp of a newborn Kelvin chick, hatched in captivity for the first time in 50 years. Ben walked toward it, Duke matching his pace, the leash swinging loose between them. The chick sat in a nest of warm fiber, eyes still sealed, body smaller than Ben's palm. Its keeper, a young Grenic with rocky features and gentle hands, stepped back to give Ben room. Ben knelt, his knees cracked on the garden path. He ignored it. "Easy, buddy," he whispered. "Welcome to the galaxy." His hand hovered, then settled, palm up and empty, above the tiny creature. The chick leaned into the warmth. Its beak opened, a thread of sound, a trust offered before it knew what trust meant. Duke's tail thumped against the garden soil. The Dravok lowered his massive head, nose almost touching the nest, and exhaled a breath that ruffled the chick's down. Not a threat, a greeting, from one survivor to another. Ben sat back on his heels. The garden stretched around him, green and growing and alive, full of creatures that had been dying in cold metal corridors before someone asked what they needed instead of what was wrong with them. The sun, or the station's approximation of it, settled toward the horizon line. Light fell across the memorial stone, across the thousands of names, across the worn leather leash where it lay in Ben's lap. Duke sighed, a rumbling exhalation, and laid his head on Ben's knee. The Dravok's eyes closed, scarred ear twitching toward the sound of the chick's breathing. Ben scratched behind that ear. The scarred one, the spot where trust had formed, where a Deathworld predator had learned that some hands stayed, that some voices whispered instead of commanded, that the most dangerous thing in the universe was simply someone willing to be present until the fear became something else. The light changed. The garden held its warmth. The list of names grew, one entry at a time, in a galaxy that had finally learned to listen.